Chapter 9. New Directions. The path ahead of them was indeed easy to follow, and they faced no opposition as they walked along through the darkness. They were all tense, and every noise made them uncomfortable. The way the leaves shook on the trees and the shadows that the moon cast upon the cobblestone seemed to be like the image of a nightmare Milo had once had as a child. He jumped at every sound and trembled every time Alice would let out a squeak of fear. Garbage would drift across the path, and the breeze carried it upwards and away. Every time this happened, even Dexter would noticeably stiffen. They tried to comfort each other with conversation as they had before, but none of their attempts would catch on for very long. The road had taken them and left them speechless. As they followed the signs to the exit, another fog moved in. Milo wanted to curse at it, but the sound of his voice seemed to be just as frightening as the other noises they faced in the park. He kept his thoughts to himself as the mist began to thicken. Before long, they were huddled around each other as they moved just to avoid being separated. "This fog is madness!" roared Dexter as he spat. Milo shook his head and tightened his grip on Alice's hand. It was only then that he noticed that they were even holding hands. He almost let go at the realization of it, but caught himself and reaffirmed his grip. He wondered if she noticed. If she did, she pretended not to, for she continued walking onward. A few times he thought he caught her looking back at him with a slight smile on her face, but the fog made him question his eyes. "Did you see that?" asked Dexter unexpectedly as he held his arm out to stop the others. He was pointing off into the distance. "What is it this time?" asked Alice, exhausted. "That dark figure. It can't be what I thought it was, though." Milo let go of Alice's hand and stepped forward for a better look. He had to wipe at his eyes to make sure they weren't deceiving him, because there in front of them was a tall, dark figure walking their way. He bore a long, ratty jacket that flopped and frayed behind him as he walked, and his hair hung down in his face. Still, Milo could clearly see that it was Victor, and he resisted the urge to pounce on him. "This can't be real. I watched you die! I watched you burn!" he screamed as Dexter nearly had to hold him back. Victor looked up at Milo and smiled. "What you see can sometimes be untrue. Never trust it." His cold voice echoed in Milo's head as the image of the train exploding into flames made its reappearance in Milo's mind. "Then explain yourself. How is it that you survived?" "I have my secrets much as you have yours, Milo. We keep them for reasons that are entirely our own. Wouldn't you agree?" His face was as still as a statue and completely emotionless. It made Milo quiver. "How did you find us?" asked Alice calmly. "I knew where you were going. You weren't hard to follow at all. I managed to find the exit while you were playing with these 3 women. Come, follow me." Victor spun on his heel and began leading them into the fog. Milo wanted to put a stop to the whole thing, but he knew it would serve him no good to try and stop it. He would just have to go along with Victor until he could get him in a compromising position. "Just this way," said Victor dryly. The gates on the other side of the park looked exactly like the ones they had entered through to begin with. They led out to a city street that was cracked and filled with overturned vehicles. The buildings here looked worse off than any Milo had seen before. Every one of them seemed to be caving in on themselves. Every brick was broken and cracked. He felt like he could see the people who might have lived here once. Like the buildings and the road, they bore chasms into their skin and possibly into their minds as well. "We should check our next move on the map," said Milo. But Victor motioned for them to put the maps away. "I know the direction," he said. Milo felt his stomach lurch in protest, but said nothing. If Victor was determined to lead his friends and Milo somewhere, there was really nothing he could do but allow it to happen. He had no real reason to doubt Victor, but his trust in him had dropped significantly. Until he knew how Victor had survived the train explosion, there could be no trusting him. "Elite Industries isn't far now. Just a couple of blocks, actually," said Victor. "But I'll warn you now, going through the front door without a plan is not what I advise you all to do." "Are there other ways in?" asked Dexter. Of course there are other ways. Some are safer than others, obviously, and we will have to plan accordingly. Once we get inside, we can go our separate ways. I'm only here for my wife. She's alive here, I know it. You three can go on looking for whatever it is you're searching for. Milo shook his head. Finally, he knew he had to speak up. No. It's safer if we all stay together. We can help each other. Look, I'll help you find your wife, and you can help me search for my father. We'll do this together. We only need each other to get inside. Once there, you would do better without me. I assure you. Milo began to argue, but Victor held up his hand. We will sleep here tonight and discuss our plans going forward in the morning. I'm tired. There was no fighting it. Victor had made his decision and immediately rolled over and prepared himself a spot to sleep for the night. Milo felt a bitter cold wind nip at his face as he pulled his only blanket up over his shoulders and clutched it closer to his head. The fabric was rough and dirty, and it made his skin itch. He was frustrated and worn out from being pulled in so many different directions. He thought he had finally started to gain control of his group again, just before Victor decided to make his reappearance. He felt his fingers clench around his cover and heard the fibers stretching and tearing. At last he relaxed his grip and let the blanket down onto his chest. His sleep would be restless that night. There's only one logical direction we can go, my friends, said Victor during the next morning's breakfast. His pale complexion seemed to shimmer in the light of the newfound sun that was shining down on them. His long black hair was flying back and forth as he quickly moved the stick he held through the dust on the sidewalk. He had been describing the ways in which they could try and enter the tower. They could make their way through the sewage tunnels and enter through the pipes, or they could attempt the subway caverns and hope they could get into the station inside. Neither option appealed to Milo. Nothing could seem like a solid plan at this point. I don't understand why we can't even see the damn thing yet, shouted Dexter in frustration. Victor's head jerked up and his hair flew out of his face. He gave Dexter a quizzical look and a small grin cracked through his expression. He pulled the map Milo had given him out of his inner coat pocket and began to unfold it before them all. Slowly he traced a finger across the crinkled paper until he came to the location of Elite Industries. He tapped his fingertip over it several times before speaking. Don't you see it? Don't you get it? He asked. Milo stepped closer and remembered how he had thought the small drawing of Elite Industries Tower had looked so funny to him before. But he still couldn't place what was so strange about it. Victor was growing impatient with Dexter and Alice and finally turned to Milo as if he were supposed to know the answer. I don't. But then he began to see it. Milo felt his own mouth drop open as the realization dawned on him. The tower goes down, not up. We can't see it because there's nothing to see from above ground. What we're looking for is underground, deep underground. Dexter and Alice both closed their eyes and fell back into a seated position on the sidewalk. Milo continued to stare at the map as if it all looked completely new and foreign to him. Victor was almost chuckling now. It pissed Milo off, but he had to admit that they had been foolish not to see it before. Down we go, my friends. Down the rabbit hole. Victor laughed. Who knows what it is we'll find down there in the dark? Why would it be dark? Aren't there offices and businesses there? Asked Alice. Oh, not anymore. Don't you understand, girl, that we're the only people here? Victor smiled as he stepped towards her. She seemed to shrink away from him. The only other people here are the ones those bastards want us to encounter to try and hold us back away from them. Everyone else is gone. Sure, there are people at Elite Industries, but they aren't the kind of folk you want to run into. I wouldn't even call them people, really. There his voice trailed off. Monsters, Milo said softly. The soldiers they've designed out of the people we used to know and love. Is that what we'll find in this place, Victor? Victor nodded his head and turned back to the map. It will be hard to see so many familiar faces again, and after so long. Dexter stood up and threw his gun over his right shoulder. He wiped a bead of sweat out of his blonde hair and brushed his hand against his pants leg. Then I guess we'll have to be careful how we approach all this nonsense then, won't we? He said with a grin of his own. Milo sat back down and began to think of the possible outcomes of this journey he had led his friends on. He had never given it enough thought, but now that he did, he was becoming incredibly fearful that his father may be one of the monstrous faces he'd find within the tower. What would he do if given the choice to kill the monster or die? Would he be able to do that after everything they had gone through just to get there and find him? It didn't seem likely. But then there was Victor, who was searching for his wife. He knew that the poor girl would be in a terrible state when he found her, yet he was marching into Elite Industries to save her either way. Milo wasn't sure it was possible to save someone once they'd become soldiers for Pandora, but he finally understood Victor's resolute position on the matter. He would do everything he could to save his father from that fate. I think we should go through the sewage pipes, he said as he stood back up and crossed over to meet Victor at the map. The subway tunnels are too dangerous, and we've already risked too much running around in them. They probably got them crawling with machines and drones, waiting for us to come waltzing back in there. The drains are really our only option. Victor smiled. I totally agree with you, Milo. That's an astute decision. Dexter and Alice agreed that the sewage pipes were the only good path to choose. Before noon, they were on their way down the street again, and making their way to whatever awaited them. Victor led them, claiming to know where a good spot to enter the pipes was located. Milo couldn't figure how Victor knew something like that, having never been here before, but he accepted it and went along with him. After all, the combination of Dexter, Alice, and himself all didn't know anything at all about the area. Victor suddenly made a turn down a dark alleyway that made Milo uneasy, until he saw that it ran down a set of cracked concrete stairs that took them below the city's surface. This is exactly what we've been looking for, Victor said with a wide smile that appeared unnatural upon his face. Dexter was holding his rifle awkwardly in front of him, as if he were ready to open fire into the darkness at any given moment. Victor chuckled and placed his hand on the barrel. Slowly, Dexter lowered it, and Victor again smiled. It wouldn't do you any good down here, he said. Milo ventured forward as the others stood behind him. Victor started to tell him to hold back, but decided against it. Milo wouldn't have listened to him anyway. He knew that the stairs were going to lead him to access the sewage underground, and nothing was going to stop him from moving forward now. The rest of them would just have to keep up. With every step, the smell seemed to get worse. Every couple of yards or so would make him stop in his tracks as he tried to block it out of his mind. The fact that he could barely see anything also didn't help matters at all. He fluttered his hands out in front of himself and realized that he was almost as blind as he had been in the fog above ground. The darkness was not impenetrable, however, and he could just make out that he was getting closer to the end of whatever path he was on. Finally, he came upon a grate that was spilling sewage out onto the path. Beyond the grate were the pipes that would lead them all to Elite Industries. Well, how the hell are we going to get through the gate? Asked Dexter as he drew upon Milo. Victor followed behind along with Alice. That could pose a problem, said Victor calmly. Milo took a step back and leaned against the concrete wall to his left. Alice made her way to him and leaned in close to avoid the others being able to hear what she had to say. I don't like him, she said flatly. Who, Victor? Asked Milo, feigning ignorance. Yes, obviously, responded Alice with a mocking tone. He sets my nerves on edge. It's just too mysterious. Milo looked over her shoulder towards Victor, who was running a hand along the iron bars of the sewage grate as if they might fall away at his touch. Some might say that you're mysterious, he joked. She wasn't amused. It's not funny, Milo. I'm being serious and you're treating it like a joke. She slapped his arm gently. We don't have a choice but to follow him. He's the only one who knows the way into the tower from here. I'm sure we could figure it out. We'd be safer without him. Milo thought about it for a moment and hung his head. He thought about how Victor and Dexter both had asked him to be leery of Alice, and what kind of person she might turn out to be. Suddenly, she was saying the same things about one of them. It would have been much easier if anything made sense. We might need him, and the fact is that he might end up needing us too. We can do a lot for each other if we choose to trust ourselves. He nodded his head in self-satisfaction at his own words. She still looked uncertain as she turned away. As she did, Milo's jaw dropped. How did you get it open? He asked Victor, astonished. My secrets are still my secrets, was the only response he received. Dexter had been watching the entire time, but refused to tell Milo and Alice what had taken place. He just said they should have been paying attention instead of smooching by themselves in the corner. We weren't smooching, Alice retorted. Well, whatever it was you were doing, you were obviously distracted from what's actually important. Dexter seemed angry about it all, and Milo didn't have to wonder long why. Dex was right. We can go into the sewage tunnels now, if you'd like, Victor's cold voice said from a few feet away. His pale face was already a good distance into the cavern. Coming or not? Dexter and Alice exchanged a glance with Milo that told him that he would have to go first before either one of them even considered stepping into the abyss. He rolled his eyes and began following Victor inward. It won't be far, and we'll come to our first intersection. I believe we'll take a left there, and continue onwards for quite some ways. His somber tone echoed through the concrete cave and seemed to carry as if Milo were hearing it from miles away. We won't have to sleep in this place, will we? The floor is wet, said Alice uncomfortably. Yeah, I don't really want to nap in a river of shit myself either, said Dexter quickly. Victor stopped and turned around. We won't have to sleep in here, he said before pausing. Not so long as you all move quickly enough, and we can reach the exit into Elite Industries before we all get tired and require some rest. Come now! Milo rolled his eyes and brushed a hand through his hair. He was sweating around the temples, and only then did he realize just how hot it was down in the sewers. He had been cold the night before when they had been above ground, and yet here he was beginning to sweat underground. It all seemed backwards. The others started complaining about the heat just as the thought occurred to him. Victor snapped at them all to quit whining about it and press forward. Milo smiled gently to himself as Dexter continued bitching. What kind of topsy-turvy shit is this? Heat underground and cold above? Did you expect things to be normal down here? Behave yourself and keep moving. In the dark, Milo felt like the tunnel walls were pushing in on him, and he slowly began to tremble. Every noise was a rumble, and every breath smelt awful. The heat and the sewage made for a terrible combination, and that combined with the never-ending darkness of the cavern set Milo's imagination spinning. He suddenly felt hands grabbing at his feet and arms being put around his shoulders even though nothing was there. In the suddenness of the moment, he gasped, and Alice nearly jumped into his arms. He laughed it off, but she wasn't so impressed. You scared me, she yelled. Don't do that. He forced a smile. I won't. Victor shushed them and motioned for them to hang a right turn. His long jacket billowed out behind him, and he vanished into the shadows. Victor! Yelled Dexter, but he gave no response. Hey! Cried Alice, but to no avail. Milo sped up to try and catch up with Victor, but stumbled over something and fell on his face. As he rolled over, he screamed at what he witnessed. There again was the ghostly white face of a man bearing down on him. He reached out a hand and helped Milo get back to his feet. The ghost smiled and then backed into the concrete wall behind itself and out of sight. Dexter and Alice came running, and Victor stepped into view. We're almost there, he said. Just this way and we'll find ourselves inside of Elite. Dexter nodded and picked at a scratch on his arm as they continued walking. But now everywhere Milo looked, he could see a ghostly image of a man staring back at him. From within the walls, Milo could see him watching the group move. Suddenly, Victor turned them all to their left and out through a small hole in the wall. "Here we are." They found themselves in what appeared to be a very large warehouse. Milo couldn't believe his eyes. Shipping crates and old boxes were piled high as far as the eye could see, and the edges of the room weren't even visible. Milo stepped out and turned a full turn as he wondered at the sheer size of it all. "To think, my friends, this is only one floor of the tower. We do have a lot of ground to cover." Victor spoke in a strangely cheerful tone. He then proceeded to walk out into the sea of crates. The vastness of the rooms seemed to be playing games with Milo's head. Every box they passed seemed to blend into the one before it. Victor led on as if he were fully confident in where he was taking them, but Milo was beginning to wonder how anybody could possibly know where they were going in a place like this. It stretched on in all directions without end and with no visible boundaries. Yet they continued around every corner as Victor weaved in and out of crate after crate. Dexter suddenly tapped on Milo's shoulder and whispered in his ear. "I think we're lost," he said. "We most certainly are not lost," said Victor from a few yards ahead. Milo looked as the two gave each other a brief stare down and then dropped back to walk with Alice, who was twiddling with her hair as she walked. She barely acknowledged that he was even walking beside her until he spoke. "If you keep messing with your hair like that, it might fall out, you know." She jerked her hand away from her hair and gave him a dirty look. "Shut up, Milo," she said. She laughed and started playing with her hair again, and Milo couldn't help but to smile. He thought he noticed Dex and Victor glancing over their shoulders at them, but he ignored it and continued beside her. She had a cut on her cheek and a bruise on her arm that hadn't been there a few days before. He wondered where she might have picked them up along the journey. But upon examining himself, he realized he had a few new scars of his own that he couldn't really explain. "Hey, Dex," he called out as Dexter stuck his head out from behind the crate he had just passed. "Yeah? Got any new battle scars we can tell people about when we get home?" he asked as he held up his arm and showed off the long, narrow cut that ran from his wrist to his elbow. Dexter laughed and rolled up his shirt sleeve to show off a large gash in his elbow that was healing up. Milo admired it for a second, and then they both laughed. "Just like old times," said Milo proudly. When they had been younger and more apt to doing things they weren't supposed to do, they would often show off the scars they had gained and fight over whose injury had been worse, and therefore more impressive. Dexter obviously recalled the memories just as fondly as Milo had, for he laughed and pursed his lips. "Not bad, Mr. Brisby, but I do think that mine is much more life-threatening." "I simply must disagree. Mine is obviously more ghastly and extreme," retorted Milo. Dexter suddenly grabbed Milo's arm and held it out in front of Alice. "Which scar do you find more impressive, my dear?" he asked. "Keep in mind that I've been shot as well." She looked down at Milo's forearm and then at Dexter's shoulder before shaking her head and walking away. "You guys are so immature that it's ridiculous," she said. But she laughed as she said it. Milo rolled his eyes and picked up his pace again. He was still passing crates that reminded him of the ones that had come before, and wondering to himself where Victor thought they were heading. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he could still see the ghostly figure of the familiar-faced man walking along beside him. The man seemed to be peering at Milo with a proud but worrisome gaze. Milo wanted nothing more than to try and speak with the ghost, but he knew that his friends would surely think he'd lost his mind. He couldn't understand why no one else could see it. "I think we're almost there, kids," said Victor with a clear voice that echoed through the room. Alice caught up with Milo and tapped him on the shoulder to get his attention. "Do you really think we should keep following him? He should be dead after that explosion." Milo didn't really know what to say to her. She was right in every aspect, but his gut instincts told him that it was not the right time to leave anyone behind. Victor may be a liar, but it was also better to have him with the group than to not know his whereabouts at all. "At least I can keep track of him this way," he finally managed to whisper back. The ghostly apparition seemed to nod in agreement from behind Milo's shoulder. "I hope you know what you're doing, Milo. We've come too far to let a stranger run it for us." As soon as the words left her lips, he knew she was right. They all deserved to finish what they had started. But Victor had a mission of his own that he had been working on finishing for a long time. It didn't seem right to make any rash decisions. "I need you to trust me, Alice. Just one more time." She smiled gently and grabbed onto his hand. He didn't know how to react at first, but his fingers seemed to slide perfectly into hers. He felt as if he were protected by her touch. "Bloody hell, I found it!" shouted Victor from a few steps away. Just ahead, he was standing at what appeared to be an industrial elevator. It was rusty and old, and Dexter laughed aloud at the sight of it. "This is how you plan to travel to the bottom of the tower?" Dexter spat at the notion. "This is going to get us killed." Victor threw open the door and stepped onto the deck. He began examining the various buttons and knobs that adorned the wall. "It's still the fastest option. Step inside," said Victor as he wrapped his long, pale fingers around a lever on the left wall. Dexter laughed again before stepping onto the elevator. Alice and Milo followed him inside and settled against the back wall. Milo felt her hand close tighter around his. "I pray we make it down with no trouble." With those words of comfort, Victor pulled the lever.